Welcome to another episode of the Mind Takeaway podcast, the podcast that helps you develop your leadership skills and create a thriving workplace culture.
I'm your host, Mira.
And I'm your host, Peter. We're joining you from Belgrade again for another episode because we were watching a local news channel this morning on live TV, and I think both of us were a bit shocked, but also it gifted us with the idea to create this episode. So today, what we wanted to talk to you about is the fact that you don't have to shout to be heard, whether that's as a leader, as an educator, as a parent, as a partner. Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's it. It's very common. So what happened this morning? We were watching a local program, and one of the political leaders was shouting, and we were wondering, why is she so loud? Why is she shouting so much? Because there was nothing to defend. There was nothing to. There was nobody who was objecting her opinion or anything. And so it was interesting. We thought she just really wants to be heard. She thinks that what she's saying is really important. So that's the reason. And she thinks people are not listening. And the other reason is that sometimes when leaders don't believe in what they're saying, they're trying to make it louder so it sounds more true. And so there are two things that I could think of why leaders are shouting. What about you?
Yeah, so I can think of a good example, not so much a politician, but when you get a group of people in a meeting and someone wants to get their points across and want to be heard and listened to and valued and all of this stuff, sometimes when they're not seen clearly, when they're not coming from a place of clarity, it makes sense to shout and add to the noise even more. And what happens is that if you're, for example, the sane person in the room, and I think we've talked about this before, if you're the calm person, the more reflective person out the meeting group who isn't shouting to be heard above the noise, if you're taking a step back and you look at this, it looks crazy because everyone is just making noise and no one's really listening to each other, and it gets louder and louder and louder. And this is what we saw this morning between what it looked like is two guests, one being the Prime Minister, was it? Yeah. And the person who was facilitating the interview, I guess the person that works for the news channel. And they didn't get a word in edgeways. It was just getting louder and louder, and the person was just talking to the camera. That was the interesting thing. And I don't really understand 99.9% of Serbian words, not yet. But again, I can read body language. I can see the way that someone is acting up. And the person was just getting louder and louder. And when I asked Mira and her cousin Ivana what was going on, they were kind of filling in the gaps for me, and I was saying, yeah, this isn't really working. And now you've explained what the person's saying. Saying it louder hasn't really made it resonate with me any better.
Yeah, so what happens when we get really loud? People start getting defensive because it feels like an attack. People also stop listening. So it is interesting. Me personally, when somebody is shouting and being loud, it triggers me to shut down. So I'm not really listening. I'm hearing God knows what. And so my response to that is probably the opposite from what the person would want to say. And I would imagine that 0.5% of population does that. The other part of population gets defensive, it feels attacked, and so they either retrieve or they attack back. So shouting to be heard isn't adding to what you really want to achieve. So what can we do differently?
Well, if you really want to have impact and be heard and stand out above the noise, the best thing you can do is actually listen. And when we say listen, listen to understand what's being said. And then if you're taking a step back, like we said, if you're that same person who's being reflective and listening to what's happening in the conversation, you're more likely to have what we call human connection, because you have already heard the other person or persons, and they're more likely to give you eye contact, to give you respect, to trust you. So when you do have some words to say, when it makes sense to add to the noise, you're more likely to be the person in the room that's going to have impact. And quite often in my career, when I was in meetings with a group of leaders or with my team, and sometimes it does get heated, it's normal, people get a bit frustrated or angry or whatever, and there might be some words said, and then, someone metaphorically throws a grenade in the room and people get annoyed, and someone else starts saying stuff, and it kind of gets out of hand. But quite often, or at least this has been my experience, either myself or one of my colleagues would be like, hey, after a bit of silence, someone would say, hey, I've just listened to what you've said. And what they would do is they would probably repeat back. So they would say, what I heard was this, this, and this. Is that right? Yeah. And people would agree. Okay, so what we want is this. Yeah. Okay. Then what we've just done is the opposite of that. Okay. And then suddenly people would settle. The room would settle. The emotions would settle. People would start to listen. It's almost like a reset. And the thing is, no one really wants to be shouted at. And like Mira said, some people, and again, this is the diversity piece, some people just don't like loud noises. Some people feel intimidated when people are shouting or speaking in a tone that might make them uncomfortable. And it might not be that the person intends to be aggressive, far from it. When people get emotional, I've been guilty of it. Sometimes you end up speaking in a tone or you're louder than you expect, or you're even aware of, but then someone in the room's retreating inside. They feel uncomfortable, and then that makes them shut down. And as Mira said before, I know when I get frustrated and maybe I raise my voice, I know that Mira has just locked down and won't listen. So me shouting or making my point any louder isn't going to add any value. In fact, it's diminishing returns from that place onwards until I stop and I reflect, and then Mira has a chance to reset herself and feel safe again and trust that she can speak or that she's been heard. And then we're both back in the room. We have human connection.
Yeah, it's so simple, and it isn't simple when we don't see what is going on. So our suggestion for it is really, one of the people in the whole situation needs to kind of stop back, reflect, and start listening, whoever that is.
I've got a good example as well. I've just thought of a client that wanted to be heard amongst many candidates, and this was a recruitment fair in Berlin, and the client was asking, what can I do to have impact and stand out? And I said, what if you just go there and you don't try to get involved in the noise, and you stand back and you just watch and you observe and you smile, and then when you see an opportunity, then you can go in and start to engage and connect. And this is what the person did, and actually they had amazing results, because the recruiter came to them and said, hey, wow, you're different. You're not trying to overwhelm me. You're not shouting and being desperate and talking and trying to offer me your CV or your business card, or trying to ram contact details down my throat and stuff like this. What do you want? Oh, actually, I'm looking at this kind of role. Oh, brilliant. Then maybe we can help you. Here's our company detail. Please apply for the role. A completely different approach. And wasn't one of your old mentors in the past, when they used to go to an event and, they're there as a business? But
so typically, when you go on a meetup where it's a business meetup, and everything is geared up so you can meet potential clients or meet potential companies that can help you. people are so invested in being heard, and they don't listen. And so then nobody's listening, and it's just lots of noise, as Peter said. And so one of my mentors decided that he wanted to take a different approach, and he started, and he just started asking questions and listening to people instead of trying to, tell them what he does and share his business card and all of that. And so people suddenly started being interested in what he does and started listening to him. So it's usually that, when we want to be heard, we think that being louder, being noisier, or when we want to be believed to what we are saying, we need to be louder and noisier, and so that's more believable, or people will hear us better. But it's actually the opposite. It's when we start listening to people, when we start paying attention to what is going on, that is the bit that has leverage. And we've also seen that with teams and managers, when team, for example, wants to be heard by the manager or by the higher management of the company, they think they don't have empowerment. They think they don't have power, so they get noisy. They start shouting, so to say, metaphorically as well. They stop listening, but they start demanding, and so it usually doesn't bear much fruit. But so, if you try that and it doesn't work, try something opposite. Try stopping and listening instead, and see what happens then.
And yeah, you never know what might happen if you're just the person who is the quiet one in the room. Try that out. If you're usually the one that fills the space with talking, I mean, I know I used to do that. If I used to get nervous, I'd be talking. And yeah, it's just try it out. Try something different. So yeah, as usual, let us know what you think of this one, and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.